You are listening to Something Rather Than Nothing. Creator and host, Ken Vellante. Editor and producer, Peter Bauer.
Hey, everybody, this is Ken Vellante with the Something Rather Than Nothing podcast, and I have quite a fascinating episode here with Samn Johnson and about an album, a song cycle called Consolation, and really strong connection, of course, to philosophy. Consolation is a song cycle composed by Samn Johnson for vocalists Tiz Kearu Zamla Carhart, setting Latin poetry from Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. It features layers of Tiz's voice, accompanied by Sam's electronics and instrumental recordings. Boethius wrote the Consolation in 524 AD while awaiting execution after his political downfall. He is visited in prison by the feminine allegorical character of philosophy. Through their imagined dialogue, it is apparent that both characters are, in fact, himself, both male and female. both free and captive, facing his own questions about his life choices, money, fame, power. Did they make him happy? Consolation, the album, has been described by composer and music critic Alex Temple as wildly polystylistic. The same can perhaps be said of Boethius's original. It is a mix of poetry and prose carried by ancient readers along in the visceral flow of Latin meter, careening between intellectual elegance and sheer terror. Sam's music hews closely to the maelstrom of Boethius's emotions, but renders it with different devices. 'Tis his voice, the backbone of the album, has pushed the virtuosic limits of range and timbre, spanning over 4 octaves with an astonishing array of colors and tuning systems. Samn Johnson, welcome to Something Rather Than Nothing podcast, and so pleased to have you on.
Thank you very much, Ken. I am thrilled to be here. Thank you.
I really enjoy the opportunity to talk to you, and having listened to Consolation, I listen to a lot of a variety of music, and there's a strong connection in my head because when I was listening to Consolation, and how it sounded, it seemed so new. I didn't feel like I was trying to look for my grounding. What's it sound like, which my head does, and just a quick background. Liz Kiger, who introduced me to your music with a strong recommendation, and I remember talking to Liz, and they just had just an incredible intelligence, and I just learned really quickly about the Baroque and some of the filming of Orfeo. And I know you've worked with Liz as well, so it was a great reconnection for me that brought me to you. But you tell us a little bit about your work with Liz?
Yeah, sure. So Liz is a very close friend, and I think one of the things that we have in common is this interest in historical music and bringing music history to life in various ways that are sort of modernizing or updating it to make it a little bit more visceral and immediately accessible to audiences. And so for them, a lot of this is creating these very aesthetically put together cinematic opera performances. And I think the way that I go about approaching a sort of maybe scratching a similar sort of itch or this desire to take this historical material and kind of resynthesize it in some way, for me is not literally using the exact music from the past, but nonetheless calling a lot on devices from historical music and from different periods of music history, and bringing them into my own compositional vocabulary. But yeah, one of the things that I do in addition to my composing is audio engineering. And so with Liz, I've done some work engineering multiple of their opera productions, including the Orfeo production that you had them on to talk about. So yeah, I really enjoy working on these sorts of early music projects alongside the kind of more contemporary music projects that I work on. Early music's a big influence for me across the board, so it's cool to have my hands on the knobs working on those recordings as well.
Yeah, oh man, I just listening to that. One of the analogies I had just in my head to understand kind of like a different period. I've always had a big literature. I study tons of literature throughout my life, and for me, it's that kind of like Old English, Middle English, almost worlds of words. And like for me, that's how I'm transported with a deep appreciation for music, but sometimes lacking the vocabulary, inhabiting that world, but then hearing it through your sounds and how you create it, the modern piece of it. Can you talk about that old world or that world and what you're putting together right now, 2024?
Yeah, sure. So, well, it's kind of a complicated question, and I come at it from a lot of different angles. So I think it's worth just mentioning at the Yeah, that you mentioning Old English and Middle English is exciting for me because I read both. I read both of those languages, and I'm involved in a lot of historical linguistic stuff. And Old Germanic languages are one of the things that I have the most knowledge of. So uh, I think really a lot of it comes down to this just personal synthesis of things that I find engaging, and I'm so interested in literature from these time periods and kind of trying to imagine these worlds that existed once and influence ours, but we can't quite get direct access to
Yeah,
anymore. That's
yeah,
not how linear time works. Um, and so I've always liked uh, just taking things that are exciting to me and somehow synthesizing them into my creative projects. And so I think part of it is just simply that I love these old languages. Latin is also one of my languages I read, and that's all the poetry on this project. I just love that poetry so much that I can't help but want to bring it to life musically in some way. So that's one answer. I just like that stuff, and I think it's neat. And particularly the poetry is so musical to start with that it really just like invites itself to be adapted to music. Another element too, I think, is a larger, more aesthetic thing where I think a lot of the sensibility that I try to express in my work relates to a little bit of this, what you might call like a meditation on impermanence, this feeling of things all going by and that being a bit terrifying, but
yeah,
also there being an element of this that is very powerful to come to some type of peace and resolution with, which is a lot of what Boethius is dealing with in his own work. And I think it's part of why the book, The Consolation of Philosophy, has spoken to me so much. So it's also just very congruent with this sort of, I often call it like a kaleidoscoping of time, where I'm trying to, music is such a time-based art form. And I like having this kind of micro macrocosmos layering active at once, where there's like you're aware of the time passing within the music itself over the hour that you listen to the album, but that also kind of kaleidoscopes out into the centuries that the album is drawing on. And you're also aware of that time having passed as well. So there's this aesthetic effect that I'm looking to create by drawing on that material as well.
yeah. I could hear, and then the listening experience. There's a couple of times I'm like, this is like cutting edge metal right here. Like, what
Yeah.
exactly am I listening to? In a thrilling way.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, some of this is just like I'm saying, I just, artistic creation has a lot, a lot of the role that it plays in my life is this sort of like amalgamating and refiltering things that I'm interested in. So it's like, yeah, I like some metal music. So, okay, that seems appropriate. I'll put that in. But also in this project in particular, it gets really, it's the most extreme that I've gotten in my work so far in terms of this sort of multi-genre approach. And a lot of it is from the text itself. It's just got such a wide emotional breadth of
Yeah,
Boethius
yeah,
experiencing this sheer terror at his impending execution, this, wailing against fate for the unfairness of the whole situation, to these moments of really sublime transcendence. And all of that's just in the text. And so
yeah,
part of actually what drew me to set it was that range, that I tend to be a little bit more drawn to making music that's kind of sedate and slow. And some of these texts is like they are so angry and visceral and violent that I'm like, like sedate and slow isn't going to cut it. So I want to set something that pushes me to draw on that much more aggressive variety of music when the text
yeah.
tells
And you
me.
can pull amongst the centuries too. That helps me understand. Helps me understand it.
Thanks. Yeah, good. I'm
Yeah,
glad.
a lot. And Tiss's voice, right?
Yeah,
I
their voice is
mean,
also extremely diverse too, and appropriate for this sort of thing. They have this huge range; it's very virtuosic, and they
oh,
also have a lot of training in or experience as well with medieval music in particular. So there's this element of historical early music sort of stuff in their way that they approach vocal performance. Um, And on top of that, they know Latin very well and are also very well versed in ancient languages and just linguistic stuff. So, it was really fun to work on it with them because, like, I did not have to coach them on the pronunciation.
Wow. I mean, I love the combination. For me, it's combinations of words, sounds, and language. One of the pieces I told this bit a couple times on the podcast in the past, but I was studying literature undergraduate at the University of Rhode Island, and I had this professor, and I was studying everything literature. It almost didn't matter. Like, it was like, throw it at me. Like, my head is like hungry to know it all. I was young. And he taught both Old English poetry course. So it was under the kind of rubric of thinking of like poetry. Same thing with the Middle English, and it got deep into the text and got deep into the sound. But the part that always threw me, and I think you might have a sensitivity towards this, was I had never had a professor, somebody talk to me about poetry and say, like, just listen to it. Like, it's almost like the meaning was, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like this, because the story was there, and he would deliver these readings of a poem from the 11th century, and I kind of walk out and I'd be like, I understood something, like I had this kind of like time travel. I'm like, I don't know what just happened. Like, this early 90s for me. I'm gonna go watch, the TV. Like, I don't know what the heck just happened, but I had that experience. Sound, right? Sound, voice. Yeah.
It does something to you, and I think this is something that modern readers really lose out on. Is that I think a lot of people don't quite understand. Maybe it's projection, but I didn't understand this for a long time. That the practice of silently reading in your head is a relatively modern phenomenon. People in the past used to always read aloud. And so all of this poetry is, I mean, I view poetry and music on like a spectrum. I don't see a strong divider between them, particularly poetry in this tradition that the Latin poetry I'm studying is, which involves these very specific meters. So it has rhythm, in some ways it's more analogous to like almost like rap or something, where it's you're not necessarily delivering them with specific pitches, although you could, but the rhythmic delivery of the poetry is really key to how it was experienced. And so, if you're just sitting there, even if you're reading it in Latin, if you're reading it quietly in your head, even if you understand Latin perfectly, like, you're still kind of not getting it. It's almost better to hear it out loud and not understand it and actually experience it as this oral musical phenomenon.
Right. Like the sound, because the emphasis, right? You had to remember, or you want to be impacted by the peril. Like, here's the peril. We're explaining, with the voice. And there's such an adventure in that. And I'm glad I had that experience, because you need somebody from the outside a lot of times to tell you, to suggest that your brain should do the opposite, how it's done by itself,
Totally.
regularly, and be like, don't get caught up, Mr. Thinker, right now, and all that. Like, experience the right? Like,
I think a lot of the kind of, whatever way that poetry is often taught, at least in recent times, the way it was sort of presented to me in high school, and I talked to people in the few generations preceding mine, and it seems like they had a similar experience, involves like, you got to decode what the poem means, and it's all symbolism and it's all metaphor, and you have to like come up with some interpretation and unravel it. And I think that's a horrible way to engage with poetry, honestly. It's just, it totally cuts you off from it, and it makes it seem like it's some alien thing that you're outside of, that you can't understand unless you think about it a lot.
Very conceptual, right?
That's not how it's, do you think like people sitting around listening to the Iliad at social gatherings was like trying to decode it? Like, they were enjoying hearing these stories about the Trojan War and being impressed by the poet's skill in delivering them. They weren't like, well, the armor is a metaphor for something. Like,
No, they were
no, it's
experiencing
not.
they were experiencing their rock and roll, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's
Like
just cool.
this is I went to the show. I gotta ask you a couple of big philosophy questions. Also,
Sure.
questions
Sure.
about you too. Is one of the kind of the identity questions I ask is seeing yourself as a philosopher,
Mm.
as an artist. I say philosopher, we're talking so much philosophy, but
Yeah, sure.
in general, I ask it. But when did you see yourself, as an artist, creator,
Yeah,
or
you know,
philosopher, like I said?
so I'm not sure I would call myself a philosopher. Maybe some days I am, some days I'm not. I don't know. With art, I can't pinpoint exactly when. I definitely see artistry as a sort of mode of being and way of engaging with the world. And I think I can see roots of it pretty early on in my life. And a lot of it involves this drive to like assimilate information and turn it into new stuff. I loved Star Wars as a kid. I still quite like Star
Yeah.
Wars. And I was also really into Legos. And I would like kind of create
Oh
these
yeah.
Lego worlds that were like Star Wars fan fiction. I would
Yeah.
take characters from Star Wars stuff and try to amalgamate them into my own Lego designs and things like that. So I think I see the artistic impulse in that type of behavior.
Sure.
And then, as I got more and more interested in music, it's like I'm just going to keep doing the same thing I was doing with my Legos, which is taking stuff that I already like and am interested in and trying to find ways to reverse engineer it, represent it myself. And so a lot of that for me was, I started out playing like rock music, and my friends that I would like, trying to make bands and stuff in middle school, and I was very quickly drawn into being like, "Ooh, these Green Day songs are cool. Why?
Yeah.
What are these things made out of? Why?"
Sure.
So I would kind of try to reverse engineer the stuff, and then sort of pivoting through an interest in like soundtrack music and video game music, I got exposed to more classical music. Particularly, I was really grabbed by a lot of 20th century music, and so okay, I thought that was cool, and then I just kept doing what I'd been doing with other music I liked, which is try to figure out how it works and reverse engineer it and start making stuff like it. So for me, that's a lot of what artistry means for me personally. And I'm not interested in like an objective definition of it. It can mean something totally different for somebody else. But for me, I think I've always had some of this impulse to kind of take experiences, refract them through my own consciousness and turn them into something else that kind of amalgamates them together.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for your thoughts on that. What about the role of art? Like, I mean, we've talked a bit about it, like
Yeah.
through our discussion and so forth. But formally, like the role of art, is it supposed to be, doing something in particular? What's the role of art?
Yeah.
We're talking here September 2024. What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. So right now, I still struggle to give an across the board answer because I
Yeah,
think
of
it can
course.
be different. But I guess in some ways, I would just say the most general sense, it's something that kind of enriches the texture of daily experience. Something that makes somebody who's experiencing its experience of the world somehow more vivid and engaged. And it can do that through a number of ways. A lot of it is social. I think in some ways art functions very similarly socially to how religion functions, and I don't have a negative view of religion writ large. I think it can be people getting into ritual settings and experiencing emotions together
Mhm.
can be a very positive thing with a lot of caveats, but that can be a very
Sure.
transformative sort of
I
group of
agree there.
experience. And I think art provides something like that. And it's not a coincidence that art and religious behavior, again, writ large, any type of ritual social behavior, so often involves singing songs together, moving in coordinated ways. And so I think part of how it enriches our daily experience of the world is by fostering connection with each other, helping us see connections between things that we otherwise wouldn't have, or even just experience our feelings more vividly and get excited or experience awe, or help process negative emotions or whatever. It can be all sorts of things for people, but I think all of them involve somehow taking something that's a bit different than just the day in, day out experience that we normally have, and somehow kind of focusing it into this emotionally enriching event.
And it makes a lot of sense to me, and a lot of it has to do. It's like the a different angle or a different, mixing things up or looking at a different way.
Mhm.
That I think's common to like creativity and in art and in new things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I and chat. Speaking of listeners, I'm chatting with Samn Johnson, and their great work, Consolation, which you can find. I listened on YouTube, and we'll talk about some places in a moment about where else you can find it. But I just wanted to recommend to everybody who's listening to the show. Just a wonderful experience and a new experience as a listener for me. And like I said, it seemed to go from what we've talked about, Sam, kind of, older music, older sounds, older, the voice, and all the way to kind of this metal edge to it and just the experience and, that emotion and so I'm a big fan of it and
Thank you so much. Yeah.
yeah. So tell us, just so make sure we get it in here since I was
Sure.
chatting about it. Where do folks find? Also saw it on Bandcamp, and there's some beautiful compilations. I was wondering if you
Yeah,
could
yeah.
mention
So
like
there's a
CDs
couple
and
of things.
such.
So
Yeah.
it's on like pretty much every major streaming service, so you can listen there. And then on Bandcamp, there's a number of offerings. You can buy a CD there if you are, living in the olden times like our author Boethius and have a CD player. Um, but there's also a paperback poetry book that I created, which was a huge part of this project for me, actually. Also, I'm sort of a hobbyist translator, although I guess I'm now a published translator, although it is self-published. But I created translations in English of all of the poetry that I set. And so you can buy this poetry book that has the Latin original set alongside my English translation, little notes on each poem. It's kind of like a souped up liner notes. But because there's such a key literary part of this thing, I had the idea at some point that like this is spilling well beyond what I could really fit in liner notes in the way that I want to
Yeah.
present it.
Yeah.
So that was very satisfying to me. Dealing with that text has just been enormously meaningful to visit and revisit. And the problem was my ideas about how to translate stuff change over time. So even after I published it, there was one thing that I noticed that was like just a mistake. There's other things where I'm like, well, I could actually phrase that differently or whatever. That's part of the fun of creating. Maybe I'll make a second edition sometime. But that was a bit of an excursion. But yes, there's that. You can buy this book and the CD on Bandcamp. You can stream it just about anywhere else.
Yeah. Well, and the thing you mentioned there on the Bandcamp, and thanks for mentioning more about that because I noticed the at least the explanation
Mhm.
of the booklet and part of it, and I was thinking, wow, that's a nice way to pull together because in the with physical media or thinking like CDs at times, some of those booklets were like discrete art objects or the
Yeah, yeah,
photography,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
the
yeah,
lyrics and photography and layout and graphic
yeah,
design. So
yeah. I love that sort of
I
thing.
yeah.
Um,
And so that option is great. So yeah, check that out on Bandcamp and again talking about consolation. Wanted to ask you the big question of the show as well to make sure we actually address
sure,
it. I mean, we're
sure. Yeah.
talking Boethius, consolation of philosophy, all this other stuff. But the titular question: why is there something rather than nothing?
hmm Yeah, so my short answer is I have no idea. I don't think it's possible to know. Boethius would have said because everything sort of sprang into being from the mind of God. It's a nice answer. I like that answer. It's a fun answer to think about, but it's beyond me to prove any of that. So I don't know. I feel like it's kind of one of those questions that you get more out of thinking about the question than in trying to answer it, at least for me. For me, anytime I deal with this question, and sometimes, at least for me, it does pop into my head sometimes. There's something kind of surreal about how much stuff there is in the world, right? I think it's something that has amazed people as long as we have any record of it. And that's why we have all of these different origin mythologies and things. It really captivates people. Like all this stuff is so complicated and rich and varied, and how did it all come to exist? And just trying to hold that thought in your head is such an enriching thing that kind of takes you someplace transcendent. So I would say, I don't know if I can answer that question, but I really like it. And I think it's just leading you to be amazed at the fact that any of these things exist and that any of us exist at all, or any of these things, to me is about as I was talking about art taking you kind of out of the everyday lived experience.
Right.
And I think this is a question that does that as well. There's so much we just take for granted in our daily operational understanding of the world.
Yeah.
Really stop. It's kind of like if you try to become like aware of your own breathing or something you do unconsciously, you realize like, wow, there's all this really complicated stuff my body's doing. And then if you think, okay, this universe exists and it's got all this stuff in it. Wow, that's even more amazing.
Sometimes we notice all the things that aren't working, and been like sometimes when you notice these systems, include our own like body system, be like, heck, it doesn't always work. We know the impermanence there. I'm not
exactly. Yeah. Then that's one of those where I was doing a translation. I'm not translating the whole thing, but I really liked a paragraph from the Sebald novel, The Rings of Saturn, which is a German novel from the 90s. And there was a passage I liked so much that I decided to translate it. And I don't remember off the top of my head exactly what it is, but one of them was like this idea that like the physician, he's talking about some like whatever, like Renaissance era painting of like people doing like a dissection. A lot of it is like also chewing on all this historical material, and he's like the physician who sees like all these illnesses in the body, like is like to him it's amazing that the body can hold together even for a day. There's a sense of like seeing how intricate it is and trying to figure out how it works just makes it like, I can't believe this thing works at all. And I think if you want to do the kind of micro macrocosm thing, the whole external working of reality are like that too. You see how complicated it all fits together. And I think it's no wonder that people have come up with all of these mystical and philosophical systems to try to explain these correspondences in reality.
So much unexplainable that like you're left trying to, I think art's a lot of times connected to that, and particularly when people talk about like language, right? And in terms of using language or art as the language, you're saying, hey, like there's reality. Like I don't know where it fits in. That's reality, and try to throw something at you. No, it's just really great to chat, and I like the kind of the ethos of the answer around the something rather than nothing, because for me, there are like a lot of questions commonly that we want answers to, like in a practical sense. And then when I studied philosophy, when I first started studying philosophy a long time ago and like doing this show, I think that, it's like philosophy is like jokes or something. It's like a disruptive thing. It's like, it seemed curious to me, like in doing all these episodes, and it's like, why is there something rather than nothing? There's no way the way I view the question that I'm like I'm closer to a great aggregate understanding of it, but
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah,
an
yeah.
impossible question from the get-go. So it's like
Exactly.
the setup is absurd to start with.
Right, right, yeah, and I love that. Yeah, and I think something that I've always kind of maybe not always. I think when I was like a lot younger, I started reading some like philosophical literature when I was a teenager, and I think at first I really wanted like a coherent worldview, and I tried like several different coherent worldviews out, and then none of them like held up very long.
Yeah.
And then the fact that they don't hold up became a big part of what I like about it. Actually, that there's something that I enjoy about seeing these systems sort of pushed to their limit and failing. And I see that in Boethius too, and that's actually part of what I like and find motivating about it. The first parts of the Consolation kind of deal with like practical philosophy questions that are like pretty convincing and compelling about like why, whatever, trying to be emperor and ruling the whole world like is not going to make you happy, and there's all these things that can go wrong, and you're actually going to be way worse off if you try to do that.
Big philosophical questions,
Yeah,
right?
so those are kind of practical philosophy. But as it goes on, it gets into some of these more abstract questions, particularly, the problem of evil. If God is infinite and all-knowing and good and stuff, how can there be evil in the world? How can people still have free will if God knows everything that's going to happen and exists outside of time? And some of the answers that Boethius comes up with for these are kind of convoluted and don't quite convince me. But I like that. Because it's like he's seeing that friction of like this brilliant mind who comes up with all this stuff that I really like and moves me, seeing him kind of run up against these same questions that also stump me.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's something about that I kind of like. And the acceptance that like he couldn't, as much as he wanted to, he couldn't quite get that all to fit together. I think ironically, that's actually part of the acceptance that I try to create at the end of the album, of this sort of, dissolving back into the source or whatever. There's this kind of mystical union that it goes towards. But I think part of that is like letting go of the ego to the extent that like you can't as an individual actually figure all of this out and know where these things come from.
Yeah. There's so many big ideas in there, and I really enjoy that. I think of like that letting go and like the questions of the ego. A lot of philosophy, I studied Eastern philosophy, but the big questions around whatever you approach philosophy, I think it's fun to have conversations around the big question, being like, we're talking like art and creativity as well, because like one of the things that fascinates me about art is just like it seems like there's very distinct prominent aspects of our lives that seem to be like near common experiences, and they're like kind of magical or mystical. And I think you end up talking about religion, or you end up talking about a system that seems to work, and being of liking that, or what it is that you move your mind towards in it. And it's just I think that the process is therapeutic and helpful.
Absolutely.
And
I do also. Yeah, I think it is one of these things where I find the process of like engaging with philosophical ideas much more useful in some ways than like actually arriving at conclusions and sorting them all out. I don't know. That's maybe kind of a postmodern way to look at it. I don't think Boethius would have endorsed that position at all. But that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm not Boethius, and it's 1,500 years later. I think he was really after like, we're going to sort out absolute truth.
I gotta figure this out. Now the pressing of time, right?
Right.
Facing death. Hey, a couple tidbits going out here. One is on Boethius. It was great that you dropped into talking a little bit more about Boethius and the backdrop for this. But would you mind just talking a little bit about the text itself? I mean, you talked about the translation, but like the text itself, the conditions under which it was written, and just your general appreciation of it for folks who might not be as familiar with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, let's see, how much time do we have? Because I could talk about that for like 3 hours, but I'll try to keep it focused on the central points. So Boethius lived around this time period that we call the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. this happens towards the end of the 400s. There are these people called the Goths, which is really a cool name, and they are like Germanic quote unquote barbarians. They're not Romans, and they essentially, after some back and forth with the Romans, end up taking over Italy as well, and that's what we call the end of the Roman Empire, in the West at least. Now, they basically just set up shop in the old Roman institutions, and they preserve the Senate, and all kinds of Roman stuff is still around. So I think part of why I'm saying like the so-called collapse of the Roman Empire, somebody who lived through it might not necessarily see it as big of a deal as we do. A lot of the kind of basic infrastructure of their life would have remained the same. And Boethius is born like right as this is happening, and he is part of the ancient Roman aristocracy. So he's one of these people who basically gets put into the Gothic administration, and he ends up he's a very successful politician, basically collaborating with this new regime that's now running the place, and he becomes something that is essentially equivalent to like a prime minister. And being a Roman nobleman, he has a lot of access to education and learning and stuff. So in addition to being a politician, he's trained in all kinds of, Greek, Latin literature, philosophy. He actually has writings that survive on all kinds of topics. He has theological stuff. He has a treatise on music. He was involved in mathematics and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
So he's one of these big polymaths who's kind of got. I've heard people sometimes say stuff like, it's always hyperbolic when people say things like this, but like he was like one of the last people who knew everything that it was possible to know in his time. After that, like learning became too broad and specialized.
Yeah, sure.
So that's kind of the type of guy he was. But being the prime minister in the Ostrogothic regime is a dangerous job. And it turns out some of his political opponents accuse him of essentially collaborating with the what we would call the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Emperor, and to restore the Roman Empire in Italy as well. We don't really know if he was actually doing that or not, or what the deal was. He says he wasn't, but like, of course he would. And that's enough to execute him. For some reason, they decide to let him be under house arrest for about a year. And he uses this time very well to create this enduring classic called The Consolation of Philosophy. And it's basically him trying to deal with the fact that he is about to be executed by the Goths. And this character, just called Philosophy, shows up and kind of walks him through all of this stuff. So like a lot of ancient philosophy, the genre is often carried out in these dialogues. Like Plato has these dialogues with Socrates and talking to people and stuff, and it's very much in that tradition, but the characters in the dialogue are Boethius himself as like a self-insert first-person character who's actually in prison in the story, and then Philosophy, who's this allegorical character who's showing up in prison to help him deal with his situation. So they talk through all kinds of stuff. A lot of it is about how the sort of pursuit of high honor and wealth and all these things that he also experienced himself as a nobleman and politician stuff really is not all it's cracked up to be. And maybe if I would have lived a life of like quiet philosophical speculation instead of trying to become the prime minister, I wouldn't have ended up in this dang prison. So part of what I like about it is that he speaks from experience on these things. It's not like hypothetical for him. He's like, no, listen, I tried it. It's not good. You don't want that stuff. And, then he gets into more abstract sort of stuff like, his whole solution to everything is that like God is supremely good and outside of everything and basically has it all in control. And even if stuff seems like topsy-turvy and bad down here in the kind of big picture view of God's mind, it's actually all fine. That's kind of his ultimate solution that he comes to. Whether you accept that solution or not, there's all kinds of great tidbits along the way. And like seeing somebody struggle with those questions in such a visceral and immediate way is really moving. The last thing I'll say about it is along the way, most of it is just prose dialogue and back and forth and they're talking and she's like doing philosophical arguments on him and he's like, gee, I guess you're right. But what about this? But she also has all of these poems. It's mostly Philosophy who delivers these poems. And they are really impressive. They cover a huge variety of different Latin meters. Boethius is in some ways kind of showing off. He has all of these different metrical forms memorized. So the poems themselves are this huge compendium that reference all this earlier poetry. And so that's the stuff that I set. I took those poems. I didn't set all of them. I sort of picked ones that I thought were most interesting to me and contained key ideas that were sort of checkpoints along the journey of the piece. Then I just set the Latin text to music, and that's how I turned into my album.
No, thank you for that background and talking about that as well. I my background in Boethius is quite limited. I would say, though, I did study for my master's in philosophy at Marquette University. And I was around a bunch of, I had to be like a large theology department and large philosophy department. And just in the circles I was in, Boethius could be passing conversation for a couple of years.
Yeah, right? People like that in theology world,
which is a wonderful environment for maybe myself and yourself. Right. Well, in taking us out here, I wanted to make sure folks find you, and also some of the, I think maybe with your website. I know there's access to your earlier works, some of the other things that you do, but if you could just make sure folks can bump into you in those ways?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm fairly active on social media, particularly on Instagram and TikTok. I have accounts. I'm not like posting every day or something, but I do tend to share a lot of stuff about my works that I have in progress, as well as I'm often kind of going back and continuing to curate and talk about all my past work. I very much don't believe in just limiting things to promotional cycles. So sometimes I will be posting about like, hey, here's my string quartet that I wrote 10 years ago, that sort of stuff. And yes, like you said, I also have a lot of that work on my website. I have scores, a lot of my more conventionally notated classical works for chamber music and choral music and things like that. Are available there. Some of them are in an online store. Other ones you'd have to email me for. But yeah, if you have a string quartet or a choir or anything, and you think this stuff sounds cool, you can go to my website and get a hold of me, and we'll get you a score. I have a little bit of work on YouTube. I'm looking to grow there. I also make some educational content, mostly about musical stuff. So I'm looking to I'll probably be continuing to expand some of that more. So that's I think that kind of covers where my stuff is.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate finding your other work in those places, and I know there's just like a lot of great material, and even thinking about the CD that you chatted about with the insert, it's like the whole art piece, thinking about it in terms of print and translation and like sound and music. So I love the opportunity to chat about all all those things. And a big shout out to Liz Kiger for the great recommendation. Mutual connection there. And Sam, thanks so much for really going into the episode, I was thinking about a lot of things at once. You know what I mean? Like thinking about all the different topics and the history and the music. Or, I mean, could have talked for an hour. I could be asking you some questions, like, in this part of the whole movement, on Constellation, what were you doing here, like in the technical, trying to understand it all. But
trust me, there's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah, be able to talk. I've just really appreciated being able to, really learn a lot from you as well. And
I so appreciate you giving me the space to talk about this stuff. And I just want to say it's been really great to have the room to talk about kind of all my ideas and my role as a composer. But I would be remiss to not emphasize that Tiss, my collaborator on this, is just a huge part of the whole thing. And this would not exist without their voice. This music is written so specifically for them, and they are just the ideal person to realize it. And that, you know, what they can do vocally, as well as just the devotion they put into really learning all these texts and doing these very demanding things, is just incredible and really worth checking out just for that part of it. It's a really incredible performance.
And just in you know, learning more about you and following Tiss's other extensive, like,
yeah, they're involved in like every art area. They are incredibly impressive visual artists. They have they have a lot of fiction that they've written. They're a translator also. Yeah, photography. Yeah, no, I mean, they're yeah, they really are amazing. Yeah, they yeah, they're one of my closest friends also, and you know, I really enjoy talking to them. We always have really interesting conversations.
It was great. Yeah, really, folks, check into the art, both Sam and Tiss, and you know, in particular with the music constellation. And yeah, thanks, Sam, for coming on to Something Rather Than Nothing. It's been a great joy.
Absolutely, so happy to be here. Thanks a lot.
All right, take care.
Take care.
Se volete potente, animos dometille feroces, ne quicta de vidi ne colla, foidi submita tabenis. Se volete potente, animos dometille feroces, ne quicta de vidi ne colla, foidi submita tabenis. Teniblica discica longe, telos tue iure temesque.
This is Something Rather Than Nothing.
And listeners, to stay connected with us and our guests, visit somethingratherthannothing.com. Join our mailing list for exclusive updates and access to guest-created art. If you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please like, subscribe, and leave a review on your podcast platform. People really read that shit. Your support helps us reach more listeners and spread our community across the planet. This is a global show, and we like to give a shout out to our many listeners across the world, including many listeners in Canada, Spain, Germany, UK, Argentina, Brazil, India, Thailand, and so many more places. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Something Rather Than Nothing Podcast for behind the scenes content. And the best way to help the show is to tell your friends about us. If you love it, they'll love it too. Tell your friends who love it. We love you. This is Something Rather Than Nothing Podcast.